Hello and welcome to this video where we will explain you how to configure single sign-on with Syncplicity using Microsoft ADFS. Before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the architecture of single sign-on. In this drawing you see the orchestration, which is on the internet, and your users can be in the internal network or outside. The first thing that users need to do is always provide us their email address. When you install the desktop client and you use it for the first time, it always asks you first for your email address. Based on that email address, Syncplicity will determine to which account you belong, and if single sign-on is enabled, it will direct you to your identity provider in your data center. If your IDP is not accessible from the internet, probably you have something in between, a load balancer, an identity provider proxy, or something else. Users authenticate to the Active Directory, and when they are authenticated successfully, the IDP, the ADFS server, will give them a Saml ticket that they will present back to the orchestration. From that moment on, the user is considered to be successfully authenticated. For devices that allow this, like your desktop client, we can provide the device with a device token, a machine token, and using that machine token, the next time you want to use the app, you do not need to re-authenticate again. As long as the device token is there, you can use Syncplicity. However, if we disable the user, then at that moment, the device token is also going to be expired immediately and the user needs to re-authenticate, of course. What is required for setting up single sign-on? The first is a SAML-based IDP. Like Microsoft ADFS or many others, you need a fully qualified domain name for that identity provider. And you see here I have the example adfs.mycompany.com or idp.mycompany.com with a fully signed certificate. Self-signed certificates are of course not supported. Because we access this from the internet or your local network, the correct firewall ports need to be opened. Then in Syncplicity in the admin console, you register your custom domain, something like mycompany.syncplicity.com. Or if you are in Europe and you use the European orchestration, then this will be something like https mycompany.eu.syncplicity.com. You also will create an entity ID, and that will tell the identity provider from which service provider the user comes from. So in my example, I will use https mycompany.syncplicity.com/sp from service provider initiated. I also need the SSO certificate from Syncplicity. Simply send the customer support department an email and they will redirect you to a location where you can download the SSO certificate. When you have configured the relying party trust, you also need to download the token signing certificate from your ADFS server and upload it into the Syncplicity admin console. And of course, you also need users created in the Syncplicity environment that will be using the same email address to authenticate in the Active Directory. Now, when that is all done, then at that moment, we can start with the configuration of single sign-on. The procedure looks as follows. You probably have the ADFS server registered so that it can be accessed directly from the internet, and you have an SSL certificate. Then you set up and test your ADFS server. Try, for example, to do an IDP initiated login. Make sure that firewall ports are opened and traffic can flow directly from your clients to the ADFS. Install the desktop client with a global admin, and we use that as a backdoor to prevent from being locked out. The configuration of single sign-on is by creating that custom domain in the admin console, register the entity ID and configure the AD. In the Microsoft ADFS console, we will create a relying party trust, also known as an RPT, import the SSO certificate and set up some claims, and then import the ADFS token signing certificate in the Syncplicity admin console. Okay, let's get started. We start on the ADFS server, and in the ADFS management console, I will navigate first to my endpoints because I need those to determine the URL of my ADFS server. The endpoint is /adfs/ls. I can test this from a browser. I use the IDP initiated sign-on page for that, which returns an error, but we can ignore that. That's not a problem. The most important for me is that I know my URL. So my host name of the ADFS server /adfs/ls, and then the IDP initiated sign-on page is just to see if I get here. When I check the URL, my certificate is fine, so I don't need to worry about that either. Then Under Services, I will navigate to my authentication methods. And it is very important that you check if the Forms authentication is checked for extranet and intranet. Then I navigate to my certificates. I see my certificate for my service, which is the wildcard. And I also see my token signing certificate. And that is something that I will use later. Now I'm going to create a relying party trust between Syncplicity and my ADFS server. Add the relying party trust. It is going to be a claims aware, and I will enter the data about my relying party trust manually. And the next step, I can give a name for my relying party trust. I give it the name Syncplicity SSO, and I give also a short description about what this relying party trust is for my other administrators. I click next, and then I could optionally encrypt the certificate. I'm not going to do that. Click next, and I will select the enable support for Saml 2.0 protocol, and I'll need to give the URL for my relying party trust. For this, I will navigate to the admin console of Syncplicity. Under admin settings, I will create my custom domain, which is usually your organization name .syncplicity.com. I'm going to temporarily enable this. For the entity ID, I will just use my custom domain, my company.syncplicity.com/sp from service provider. I will refer to my sign-in page using the host name of my ADFS server / my endpoint, so /ADFS/ls. Leave the logout page what it is as a default, but copy my custom domain, my entity ID, and I'm going to use that in the ADFS wizard for the assertion URL. So I will remove the SP and I will replace this with auth/assertion consumer service.aspx. That is going to be my consumer service URL. Click next, and then I'm going to use the relying party trust identifier, which is my entity ID, add it to the list. You could optionally add more. Click next, and in this step I can permit who can authenticate using this relying party trust. You can customize this for multi-factor authentication, but I'm not going to do that right now. Maybe later. I'm going to permit everyone. And actually this is more or less the steps I need to do to create the relying party trust. Because it's a claim-based relying party trust, I need to also add some rules. I'm going to need to add 2 claims, and the first one is an Active Directory rule. Send LDAP attributes as a claim. Because Syncplicity relies on an email address, I need the ADFS server to return me an email address. Return email address to Syncplicity. Select from the Active Directory that the Active Directory needs to use the LDAP attribute email address, and it needs to send it as an email address to Syncplicity, because Syncplicity identifies users based on the email address. The next step is to create a transform incoming claim rule. And for that, I'm going to specify as a name, the claim rule name, email to name ID. So the incoming claim type is an email address. The ID format I'm going to leave default. And the outgoing claim type is going to be name ID from the ID format email address. And any other claim values, I'm just going to pass them through. I'm not going to touch them. This allows the username and other attributes to come back. That's it. I have now configured my 2 rules. What I now need to do is add a signature. Click on the properties of my relying party trust. I will need to add the signature, the Sso certificate that you got from Syncplicity. Simply click on the add button and navigate to the Sso certificate that you received from Syncplicity. I already requested this, so I just only need to upload it. And you can check here the Sso certificate. Click on open, and there it is. The certificate is valid until February 2022, and that is done. Because I uploaded the certificate from Syncplicity, I also need to use the token signing certificate. That is very important because sometimes customers make a mistake, but you need the token signing certificate from your ADFS server and upload that into the relying party trust. Copy the certificate to a file. There's also a wizard. Select base64 for the encoding. Click next and give a file name. I will use the My ADFS token signing certificate, and I'll also specify a name for it. So if next year my ADFS server would update the certificate, I can distinguish each certificate. The The thing is that every token signing certificate has also an expiration date, and the ADFS server will renew it automatically, but I will need to make sure that I update Syncplicity with that latest token signing certificate. I need to rename the certificate from CER to DER before I can upload it into the admin console. When I've done that and I've saved my changes, from that moment on, single sign-on is enabled. In order to test this, I recommend you to not do this in the same browser that you did to enable and disable single sign-on. So quickly flipping over from Internet Explorer to a Firefox browser, navigate to the custom domain, residencenewland.syncplicity.com. I'm being redirected to the ADFS page and I can authenticate using my Windows credentials. After successful login, I'm being brought back to Syncplicity and you see here the custom domain. That's great. So I'm successfully authenticated. I can do this again from a private window and now navigate to my.syncplicity.com. I can enter the email address and again I'm being brought back to my ADFS server and I can authenticate again using my Windows credentials, either the email address or your corporate domain / your username and a password. And again after that I'm being brought back to my custom domain. So I have success. So far for a successful authentication flow, but what if things go wrong? Everything starts with your custom domain URL. That should bring you to your identity provider authentication page, in this case ADFS. If that doesn't work, then probably your IDP does not recognize the entity ID. So that is a good place to start. Is your entity ID the same in your single sign-on configuration page in Syncplicity, then the entity ID name or ID that you have given in your ADFS server. Next, does authentication work? I have seen situations where the email address could not be used to authenticate and users had to use their domain name and their Windows credentials to authenticate. And then you should be redirected to Syncplicity. If that doesn't work or you get a strange error message, the first place to check is the Saml Response. And what you see here is a screenshot of Saml Tracer, a little add-in for Firefox and Google Chrome that allows you to see how the response looks like that ADFS would give you. In a successful authentication flow, you see the email address being returned. But if that doesn't work, or if you don't see your email address, then there's something wrong with the certificate that you exchanged. Are you sure that you uploaded the ADFS token signing certificate? And a common mistake is a problem where the ADFS server is not being synchronized with a time server, and there is a significant time difference between our cloud infrastructure and your ADFS server. And because of that time mismatch, we miss the gap. And usually if you see the not before or not after, then you probably are encountering that kind of issues. So troubleshooting always starts with Saml Tracer. Saml Tracer is a free add-in that you can download and it will help you to troubleshoot majority of the issues with your authentication flow. Another thing that can go wrong is Ssl Revocation Check. This is because your ADFS is not allowed to access the internet and it is unable to verify the certificate from Syncplicity that you uploaded as part of the RPT configuration. If things don't work, it is because usually your ADFS is not accessible from the internet. This might require a VPN, or you can only authenticate using a local network. Another one in the top 5 is the wrong certificate being imported in the RPT configuration or the wrong certificate imported in the Syncplicity admin console. And another very common mistake is that the wrong email address is being used. So when you are successfully authenticated in AD, the AD returns a different email address than the one that you have used in Syncplicity. For this, I'm going to use Firefox to test the connection. And I'm also going to use a little tool which is called Saml Tracer. I really love that tool because it helps me to troubleshoot any issues. It's now an add-in in my Firefox browser. I enter my email address. I'm being brought to my ADFS server. That is good. I authenticate using my domain credentials and you see that I'm authenticated. Now, when I navigate in the Saml Tracer to the Saml Response that I got from my ADFS server, here I see some interesting things that also can help you to troubleshoot. The first is where I come from. This is my custom domain and my assertion consumer service. I see there the success and the signature that I'm being using. It comes from adfs.mycompany.com. And a little bit lower, this is also very important. I see the not before and not after, because sometimes an ADFS server is out of sync in time, and that means that you cannot authenticate. And a little bit lower, I also see the email address that my ADFS server returned to Syncplicity. Again, another important item to search for to troubleshoot your connection. I want to show you the success status that I received from my ADFS server. But for me, the ADFS SSO configuration is completed.